Welcome to Kanata Connections. I'm David Watts. I am Kanata, and I, that is we. Villages of life that stretch from sea to sea to sea. A human constellation, as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanata, Canadien, we are Canadian. In the first two foundational traits, we looked at Kanata as a village and as a constellation of villages. Like the rivers that drain our half-continent in four directions, Kanata is also a continuity. We were the first modern state to emerge on the world scene without revolution or civil war. Yet most of our span lies outside history, her story, our story, even when supplemented with oral traditions. We have no one date, event, or document that determines us, no single shared hero, founder, father, or mother figure to whom we look as a model, or after whom we've named our capital or any major city. Conversely, we have no villain, tyrant, or despot, no King John, Tsar, or Louis XVI who provoked us to react. George III, for us, was the monarch whose 1763 proclamation began the process of negotiation with First Nations that continues in the numbered treaties. When the Lakota chief Sitting Bull sought to enter Canada as a refugee a century later, he presented as a passport a medal his grandfather had won for supporting George III against the American Revolution. As a constellation, we don't even have a single point of origin. If we try to pick one, someone invariably points out they and their people were here before. When we called 1967 Canada's 100th birthday, Québécois reminded us that that was the centenary of Confederation, not of Canada, and that they'd been living here as Canadiens and Canadiennes for 260 years earlier. O Canada was their national anthem for 100 years before it was adopted by the rest of Canada. And when a member of the Quebec National Assembly referred to Indigenous peoples calling themselves nations 30 years ago as provocative, he did not see the irony of his peoples begrudging that description to others who had been here more than 40 times as long as Europeans. During the last 500 to 1,000 years of this unknown incremental period, when knights in Europe were fighting crusades when they weren't fighting each other, there began to be meetings between people living on the back of the turtle and those from other floating earth plates. What's now called contact, capital C, is not one event at the beginning, but rather a wave of events. There were many contacts made over a millennium, differing in quality from each other. On the west coast of Vancouver Island, a South American Spaniard had an ongoing relationship with a First Nation and its leader that was a model of equality and respect. Quadra is the same as Maquina, and Maquina is the same as Quadra. Some encounters, of which we know very little, occurred in the far north on the frontier of Russian Alaska and pre-Confederation Canada. It may be that the parties shared bonds as foreigners in a challenging environment equal to the ties to the lands from which they'd come. The first successful transit of the North by sea was by a party led by Roald Amundsen. It survived by forming relationships with Inuit women at Joe Haven. A second, in the other direction, was by Inspector Henry Larsen, a Norwegian who joined the RCMP. These men remind us of the first visits to North America by the Vikings. More invasive forays took place on the Atlantic side of Turtle Island, where European states and empires competed for fishing grounds and later fur trade. Over 125 years, ended by the 7 Years' War, French and English armed each other's indigenous allies in a struggle for dominance. Civilian settlers were often collateral damage, even by those of their own ethnic group. Saint Laurent-based fur traders had a distinctly different orientation from land-breaking farmers along the river, much as the Northwest Company traders later opposed the Selkirk settlers. In 1759, Britain replaced France as the leading world power, as France had earlier replaced Spain. A century later, Britain was overtaken by the United States. The 13 colonies were able to revolt after France was expelled from Turtle Island. Their War of Independence succeeded due to French support that bankrupted France's treasury, leading to the French Revolution. The Union's victory in the Civil War made the United States the strongest military power on earth. What is now Canada has been colonized by 5 foreign powers. Now a satellite of the U.S., as we were earlier of France, then Britain, the people of the north half of the continent reconfigured themselves in steps towards self-government. Most recent is an attempt to eliminate social and systemic barriers that have dislocated First Nations, a resurgence that may be a fulfillment of the last being first and the first last. As an evolutionary culture, our experience became a template for transition of former colonies that make up the Commonwealth. Scholars may point out that revolutionary countries also evolve, that the United States today has grown beyond the Constitution signed by the founders. Yet we are shaped by our birth experiences, and between revolutionary and evolutionary states is a difference in degree and kind. The U.S. Revolution sought separation from the past and parent state, between states and the Union, and in making legislative, executive, and judicial powers separate arms of government. Canada's goal at Confederation was integration, continuing the link with the Crown and parent state, greater control of local affairs through the federal power and disallowance and federally appointed lieutenant governors, both have lapsed, and integration of executive and legislative powers with cabinet ministers who are members of Parliament more closely bound together than a confederation due to a larger corps of officials in the Prime Minister's office. In one way, Canada and the U.S. have both evolved at variance from their original goals. Decades of rulings from Britain's Privy Council, Canada's highest court of appeal until 1949, expanded provincial powers and emasculated federal control, making the Kanata constellation one of the most decentralized in the world. In the U.S., the range of states' rights has been offset by the U.S. Supreme Court rulings and the power of the military-industrial complex to shape the economy. Yet in a fundamental respect, evolutionary and revolutionary cultures are diametric opposites. Revolutions are built on grievances. The U.S.'s were explicit in its Declaration of Independence. Many intolerable acts blamed on the tyrant George III in the preamble are benefits in Canadian eyes. Extending of rights to Roman Catholics and their bishops in the Quebec Act, and protection from settlement of Indian lands, keeping them for, of all people, the Indians. But they were served up as insults and oppressive to an American audience, as if generosity to Catholic Quebecers was evidence the King was about to establish a Catholic feudal regime for Protestant New Englanders, taking away the rights of dissent they had in their assemblies. Reserving Indian lands for natives, proclaimed 11 years before the Quebec Act, was presented as a curb on property rights, by which settlers claimed unused lands to farm and homestead. Evolutionary regimes grow from gratitude. For physical and cultural health and survival through largesse to pursue one's life and livelihood, and the military protection of the state, personified in the sovereign against unfriendly outsiders and unscrupulous practices at home by wise laws. The Quebec Act was crafted precisely to win the gratitude, or at least the neutrality, of French-speaking Catholic subjects in New France who had come under British colonial administration, as the earlier proclamation was made to win allies by promising to respect Indigenous land. These measures worked in persuading First Nations and Quebecers they'd get a better deal from the British than by joining a revolution of Americans who earlier felt justified in trying to seize the lands of French because they were Catholic or Indigenous because they were pagan. The revolutionaries' offer of freedom rang hollow against this record of past behavior, and when Quebec declined to join the revolt, rebel armies invaded to try to force freedom on them. Our evolution is mirrored in changing meanings of Kanata, our name. 500 years ago, when Cartier landed on the west end of Montreal Island and named it China, La Chine, Kanata meant a village or string of villages along a great river. 300 years ago, Canadien or Canadien meant to be French and Catholic. 150 years ago, to be British in North America. Today, before we insert diversity or some other flavor of the week, why not adopt the legacy of those who gave us Kanata as a musical sound and spiritual symbol of a village it takes to raise a child? The one who can define Canada has not been born and won't be because it's always changing. This is like drawing a bucket of water from the river for biochemical analysis. Water in a bucket grows stagnant. Releasing it back into the stream allows it to be what it will be, and we likewise. Some say Canada's evolutionary nature comes from the legacy of British parliamentary government. That is not a sufficient explanation. The rise of parliamentary supremacy in Britain was a tumultuous process, preceded by a revolution more radical than the later French one, events in which both kings lost their heads. That revolution was followed by a decade of Puritan dictatorship, until Britain restored the monarchy under the late king's son with limited powers. By destiny or default, Canada missed 3 revolutions: the American War of Independence that Quebec declined to join. Refugees from the U.S. gave Canada its first major English-speaking settlers in the Quebec townships, the St. John Valley of New Brunswick and Upper Canada. The French Revolution occurred 26 years after Quebec's takeover by Britain ended the link between Quebec and her parent state. Quebecers felt orphaned by the radical secularism of the French Revolution. The English Revolution, 1639-60, that beheaded Charles I and ended the divine right of kings. Canada had no ties to Britain during this period, being part of New France until 1759. Newfoundland, that did not join the mainland till 190 years later. Being outside the sphere of conflict in these struggles, Canadians did not historically divide into traitors and patriots, except in the uprisings in Lower and Upper Canada that occurred in 1837 and approximately the same time as working-class Chartist riots in England. The Patriot label had greater appeal in Quebec, where the uprising extended into 1838. Today, La Fête des Patriotes has replaced Quebec's May long weekend, Victoria Day, in the rest of Canada. The 1967 centennial of Confederation, though not Canada's 100th birthday, was celebrated in a pictorial tribute edited by Roloff Benny and entitled "To Everything There Is a Season," words from Ecclesiastes 3 that American folk singer Pete Seeger set to music in the song "Turn, Turn, Turn." The words and images in that volume convey magnificently the seasonal sense of what it is to be a continuity, expressed in the timeless words with which First Nations affirm their treaties. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. Let us manifest that spirit in gratitude for the gifts of life, forgiveness on ours and others' mistakes, and generosity towards the earth and all who walk it with us. For Kanata Connections, I'm David Watts.
Kanata, au long des rivières, les villages lumineux au-delà des frontières, a human constellation as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanata, Canadien, you're Canadian.